Hello, I'm Alexandra Monroe, Senior Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs of Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. And it's a great pleasure to introduce you today to my friend and colleague, András Szántó, who will be giving a talk, The Museum in an Expanded Field. We are deeply honored to have András as part of our forum and to present one of the summit's keynote talks. András Szántó is a widely published author who advises museums, foundations, educational institutions, and corporations on cultural strategy and program development worldwide. Very early on in the stages of the Guggenheim Museum's discussions with Abu Dhabi for the future Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, András also helped us formulate some very important ideas that have continued to shape and inspire our idea for the future museum. András has lectured on art business at the Sotheby's Institute of Art and has directed the National Arts Journalism program at Columbia University. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, he helped launch and oversee the Global Museum Leaders Colloquium, a series of 10-day seminars for international museum directors that was really the first initiative of its kind developed by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, certainly America's greatest encyclopedic art museum, which was struggling at the time with understanding what it was meant to be a global art museum in a contemporary sense. András's most recent book is The Future of the Museum, 28 Dialogues. Over the summer of 2020, when museums around the world, including the Guggenheim, were shuttered due to the pandemic, their financial models in shock, and their public role challenged by the social justice movements that shook cities around the world, András began a project of interviewing museum directors about this historic juncture in our cultural life, our cultural economy. Several of the people he interviewed are speakers in this year's Culture Summit. They represent museums large and small, in cities and in faraway places, established ones and those not yet open. The book has received wide notice and has quickly become a kind of textbook for navigating museums in the pandemic and post-pandemic world. We have asked András to discuss the book and share its impact as museums reemerge, definitely changed. Mm-hmm. Just to note that there will be a Q&A following András's presentation. Thank you very much. András, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Hopefully we'll be meeting in the region soon. When you invited me to do this talk, it coincided with a week when a very interesting book arrived in the mail. I'm very grateful for the Sztuki Museum in the town of Lodz in Poland for sending it to me. They had read my book and they sent their book on the avant-garde museum. And it's a book that takes us back to a time when the early modernist era, a time of great tumult, a time of great social change, and a time when museums by and large look like this, the one on the right, the Hermitage Museum. And in the next 30, 40 years, the idea of the museum would change thoroughly, and museums began to look rather different, including one that you will recognize over here. And as I was reading this book and the wonderful documents in it, I became very perceptive to the fact that there was some interesting parallels to that moment in time and our moment. The world was changing. People on the front lines of cultural debates, the avant-garde, vanguard artists and thinkers, were sort of involved in two attitudes about the museum. There were some who believed that the museum was to be rejected, to be consigned, if you will, to the trash heap of history, something that was emblematic of the past social order and didn't need to be pulled forward into this new era of modern change. And there were others who thought the museum ought to be reformed. And luckily, the reformists won out. And today and in the years to come, we saw a completely new type of museum telling stories in new ways, thinking in new ways, installed in new ways, architecturally different. And it gave us a wonderful century of museum making. Now, in the last year, the year of 2020, we were in some ways again in a similar moment, and a moment greatly exacerbated by the pandemic crisis, which, as Alexandra referenced, closed down our institutions. But it was not just the fact that museums were closed, it was that they were also fundamentally being questioned. And at this time, as Alexandra mentioned, I decided, it was exactly a year ago, that I decided to do this book, which came together very quickly. I thought this would be a good moment to talk to museum directors around the world, not just about the experiences that they're having in the pandemic itself, but what they conceive to be the future of the museum. And I have to say it was an eye-opening exercise. But by and large, immediately, there were three things that became very clear, what I call the three pivots. I mean, these are stories that we understand happening in all museums. Number one, they were turning towards their communities, partly because the community is all they had, but also I think it led to an outpouring of energy from the museum towards the community. Wonderful examples of museums feeding their neighbors, the Dresden Museum doing a letter writing campaign to 100,000 of its neighbors in Dresden, a kind of new commitment to the local community. The other great pivot, of course, last year, after the horrific murder of George Floyd and the ensuing Black Lives Matter movement, was a major recalibration of the museum in the context of social justice, a deep questioning around the museum's role in contemporary society and how it can address some of the great issues in a society that was really being pulled apart along these lines. A third great pivot, which was extraordinary to watch and which is certainly known to everyone in this audience, and in fact our session today is an example of it, was the digital pivot. It is really truly an extraordinary thing what museums did in a very brief period of time, shifting their programming and their outreach to digital channels. And it's great luck that we had tools like this one, Zoom, at our disposal. But as we were having these conversations, it quickly became clear to me that in fact, something more was going on. And the conversations, and especially when I put them together, reflected the fact that we were in the midst of a rather large systemic shift in our field, a shift that's been going on for some time, but a shift that was really intensified, accelerated, catalyzed in the context of the boom. And I'm going to be very simplistic here, but by and large, museums were expanding their traditional functions. We all have, all of us who went to sort of, classes on museums know that the traditional functions of museums are these: to collect, to preserve, to display, to study and interpret. But when I was talking to the directors in this book, the words I kept hearing were these: the aspiration to become more experiential, to become more innovative, democratic, collaborative, reaching outside the museum to other areas of practice and knowledge, science, technology, NGOs, to become more open and welcoming, have a different posture and attitude, to be politically responsive, socially engaged, and above all, truly inclusive. And these are aspirations. I'll give you one example from the book, were beautifully formulated by my great friend Ann Pasternak here in Brooklyn, New York. She said, fundamentally, we should aim to be pillars of society, public places where you can come to learn, meet other people, share ideas, debate, and even disagree. Not the idea of the museum that we might have imagined a century ago, but a more expansive, an expanded field of museums was emerging. Now, I have to tell you, this is not all new. This strain of opening up the museum to a larger public is really a project that harks back many decades. Many of us remember the great Tutankhamen show, the birth of the blockbuster period in the 1970s. when museums began to see their success, not just in terms of the objects they own, but in terms of the audiences they attract. A great many of the directors in the book, it was very interesting to hear, maybe it's a generational issue. They mentioned the Beaubourg, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, as their touchstone museum. It arrived like a UFO in the late 1970s, transparent, open, porous, rejecting old hierarchies, surrounded by public space. You could walk through the museum. It had a post office. It was a very different idea of the museum already. And of course, I don't need to tell this audience, a whole new word was invented when the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao opened, and the idea that museums could in fact become emblems of cities and nations and aspirations and attract tourists. So there's a long history, which we could spend a long time on, about this kind of outreach and this sort of growth in aspiration. And indeed, as we were heading into the pandemic, literally as we were heading into the pandemic in 2019, ICOM, the International Federation of Museums, was at work on creating a new definition of the museum. I have to tell you, this was not a success in its own moment. The work continues. But I put it on the screen today for you, and we highlighted the words. And you can see even in this new definition, which again has been hotly debated, but you can almost see how the traditional functions of the museum, highlighted in white, were now surrounded by a whole new vocabulary and terminology expressing the new, broader, more socially engaged aspirations of the museum. And while, in the words of Suhanya Raffel, the director of the wonderful new M+ Museum, which is almost open now in Hong Kong, the other great museum opening in the coming years, she said, we couldn't all agree on the new definition when the delegates of ICOM met in 2019, but we all did agree that it needed to change. So there was already a sense of desire for shift, for change, for evolution in the museum. And these conversations had been going on professionally. By the way, these are the wonderful glass easel galleries at MASPI in Sao Paulo, themselves transformed by a new kind of polyphonic storytelling. But anyway, so where were we? What is the big question we have to ask ourselves in this moment? In a time of great change, how can we model a new type of museums and adapt it to a fast changing society? This was really what the book was about. And this is what I think our moment is about in this field. And I think we can discuss it very simply, staying at sort of 30,000 feet in the context of some great shifts in perception, shifts in aspiration and attitude. And I'm going to just name a few of them, inevitably incomplete because of our time. Starting with the idea of the shift from vertical to horizontal. This is a shift in attitude. Instead of knowledge being dispensed from on high, the museum extending the hand laterally, engaging its communities as equals, as partners, as conversation partners. This is not to say that you can't have a horizontal posture in a vertical museum. In fact, this wonderful museum in Barcelona has wonderful programs. I'm not trying to judge anybody, but you can see how these ideas of verticality, hierarchy were even encoded in museum architecture in the previous century. Another related shift in perception is that from exclusive to inclusive. I think if we're honest with ourselves, and we don't have to be honest with ourselves, we can just read the newspapers, there is still a very broad perception of museums as being for the higher segments of society. And indeed, museums often play into those stereotypes. But if you actually look at the field of museums, particularly modern and contemporary art museums, you see this tremendous effort to become more inclusive, to create welcoming places, to engage the full spectrum of their communities. This is the incredible, beautiful Museum of Modern Art in Medellin in Colombia. Now, the other great shift, and of course, I'm speaking in a discussion headlined by Alexandra Monroe, who's probably the greatest champion of these efforts, one of the greatest champions of these efforts in the world, is a shift in how we tell the story of art from a rather standardized model, with apologies to Alfred Barr for the great MoMA chart from the last century, to a more polyphonic way of collecting and exhibiting and creating narratives around art. This is an exhibition by my great friend Pablo León de Barra at the Guggenheim, part of the Guggenheim's very strategic and ongoing efforts to become a more polyphonic, which ended up being so deeply embedded in the concept of the Abu Dhabi Guggenheim and fully realized, I think, there. This is probably the single biggest change. It's happening in every museum. It's well underway. But as someone who actually grew up in a small country behind the Iron Curtain in Hungary, I know very well how many of these histories had formerly been written out of the main narrative. Museums are now working to include them. Now, alongside these changes is another very important shift, which I would call a shift from the pedagogic to the experiential. Art being explained to you versus art being experienced by you. It's a subtle shift in the idea of what a museum does, and I'm not suggesting every museum now needs to turn into the Atelier des Lumières in Paris, although these events are extraordinarily popular. But we are generally seeing this shift, partly because artists themselves are creating highly experiential works using modern tools, but also because of the idea that if we do this the right way, we can help audiences discover art on their own terms. You don't need to be just educated about art. We can help you have that engagement. This, of course, is one of the central features of our moment. The realization that museums, or the heart of the museum, is that sublime moment of in-person encounter with a unique work of art. That is the main reason we go to museum, I believe. Call me a traditionalist. Nonetheless, this generation of museum leaders is leading the way to shifting the museum into a multi-platform format, a museum that can manifest itself on a laptop, on an iPhone, and in this case, in Tel Aviv during the pandemic, on the walls of the city, to bring the museum to the citizens at a time when they couldn't come to it. To me, very important shift is, and again, you could call it attitude, but it really translates into really complex issues around how you furnish a museum, how you design it, what kind of architecture you deploy. Is this idea of moving from a high temple to what we call a third space. A third space in the language of marketing is a space that's between work and a home. I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about museums to imagine them as this third space, a space where you would go, regardless of whether you plan to see an exhibition, a place where you can hang out with your laptop, meet friends, socialize, and yes, participate in the cultural experiences afforded there. You see this shift in transforming museums today, particularly their outdoor spaces. And alongside this, I think is a kind of revolution happening in museum architecture. Many museums in the past have been rather self-enclosed. I don't want to say that they turned their back to the city, but they were sort of a box, and you had to sort of go inside the box to experience the art. If you allowed yourself to cross that threshold, if you felt entitled to cross that threshold, the buildings themselves often quite monumental, versus the idea of a campus, integrated with nature, integrated with the city, human scale, something that provides different types and textures of experiences intermingled in the course of a day. And the last major shift in attitude is what I would call a shift from edifying to fun. A museum doesn't always have to be serious. When people are asked why they go have cultural experiences, they often say they want to have a good time in the company of others. Here we have on the right my great friend Marc-Olivier Valère playing around in the Art and History Museum in Geneva, which he runs, and where they recently reinstalled a collection with the help of an artist, injecting a sense of humor and levity into the proceedings. Ultimately, and this is the last one, perhaps the most important one, I think in terms of the shift of perceptions, ours is a moment when we can recognize a shift from the idea of the museum as a relatively homogeneous, as a relatively, how should I say, centrally guided concept that's mimicking established models, mainly coming from the global north. These, by the way, are the newly beautifully lit galleries at the Met. When you can start traveling, I encourage you to go. To the idea of museums in the plural, many different kinds of museums, because as museums have proliferated around the world, as they have engaged deeply with their specific communities in their particular cultural contexts, in their particular climactic zones, they are now more free to be different museums as they adapt and grow. And I feel that one of the main conclusions of my book, in fact, is that if the late 20th century gave us a pluralism of art, this great efflorescence and polyphonization of art, then perhaps the 21st century will bring that pluralism, that great opening up of possibilities for museums. So in closing, I just want to leave you with a few deep questions, because those shifts are happening. But I think what animates the museum are a couple of really deep questions, which I hope this conference can address and our field can continue to address. How to make the museum accessible and sustainable without abandoning commitment to scholarship and quality. This is a balancing act that every museum director in the world is trying to figure out. Secondly, can the museum help to find common ground in an increasingly polarized, commercialized, atomized society? In many cities, many countries, the museum is one of the few places where people of all backgrounds can come together without a demand to consume or without the demand to think in a certain way. Very important question for the field. Also important, maybe this is something we feel especially in America these days, can the museum be a reliable voice in the post-truth fake news world? This goes deep to the heart of the educational and scholarly mission that museums have always had as Enlightenment institutions. What is our role in addressing systemic inequality of wealth, power, and opportunity? A question that impacts collecting, storytelling, hiring practices, governance, architecture, every single feature of the museum. And perhaps largest of all, how to make the museum indispensable, not just for the few, but to be perceived to be indispensable to the lives of many people. So once again, after a century, remember we started with the modernist era, time of huge changes when people were both questioning the museum and working to reform the museum. I think the question for us to ask is, in this new moment of seismic change, when institutions are again being questioned, again being criticized, will the museum be open to reform for further evolution? And of course, that's a rhetorical question because I can only answer in the affirmative. The answer is yes. And I think the opportunity for the museum field at large, but particularly for the Abu Dhabi Museum and the new museums in the UAE region and globally, is to encode these ideas, make them part of your DNA, not have to unlearn them, but to already build for this new future. And that will be the next stage in the evolution of the museum. So thank you very much. And now I quickly come back to Alexandra.
Thank you so much, András. That was very catalytic, to use one of your favorite words. Really, thank you. A perfect summary and quite a challenging, but also exciting platform of the future for all of us to think about. I mean, I feel like one of the other sort of seismic shifts that's come out of 2020 is, and it's not only because some of us are working on museums that will open in the future, it's we are really engaged. These questions are compelling us to be engaged with thinking about the future. We were initially museums, I feel, as you said, you know, temples to the past and to history as a guide, as as a kind of quintessence of virtues and values of a society. And then we moved to the contemporary, where we were celebrating the present and giving enormous space to our contemporary artists to kind of help us read into the events, political events, social events around us. But I feel like the question that's come out now, which is first in my career, we are about the future. Everybody's asking about the future. And we sort of suddenly feel not just stewards of the past, but inventors of a future. I think that's where the excitement comes in, is it's actually a time of great imagination for museums. And I think your questions will guide that imagining. So thank you. We have a few questions that are coming in. Two I want to bring to your attention in that we only have 5 minutes left, but you know, you're speaking to an audience right now, András, that comes, lives and works all over the world, and some perhaps in states that might not be as open to change, even than the ones that you might assume. So how might this new museum model engage audiences and political leaders who are resisting progress and equality in this time of great change and social reform?
Well,
I mean, we can think of China, actually.
I happen to, as I mentioned, I grew up in a communist country, in a closed society. And anybody who's lived in a closed society knows that the situation is always more complicated. Just as in the late 1970s in Eastern Europe, there was a vibrant intellectual life, and curators and museums were doing heroic things, and artists were engaged in very interesting, sometimes very subtle practices. I think that in all societies today, we see aspects of this. And I think that there is today still very much a confraternity of museums around the world, an international art conversation that even in the most closed societies can be apprehended. And I think, I believe that institutions can be, as you say, catalysts of social change. They have to play a long game, because they also have to stay open and be resourced. But invariably, in every society, we see museums playing this long game, sometimes very deftly. On a related note, I should say, I'm a great believer in cultural diplomacy. We're having this forum related to Abu Dhabi. I believe that the visual arts, museums, as orchestras and other cultural entities, can play a very important role in beginning to open up societies, linking them to the world, back to the world. Many of these societies used to be very connected to the world, and that institutions have a great role to play, and they have to commit themselves to a long commitment to doing that, because it sometimes takes decades to get to where you want to go.
If you can answer very quickly, we only have 2 minutes, but we have so many great questions here. Oh my goodness, where do we start? I'm sort of interested in this. As these institutions move to more pluralist democratic structures, what do you think the impact is on traditional elite philanthropic structures?
Yes,
and you've got
unfortunately, the traditional elite philanthropic structures are moving away from museums. I think the larger question we have to ask is, what about the new philanthropic structures? I believe that in order to get the support of today's great wealth holders, the museum has to demonstrate its indispensability. So everything that I talked about today, these aspirations to open up the museum, to make it indispensable, will be successful, or will be a way to re-engage philanthropy, which frankly has many times moved on to other greater problems. So museums have to demonstrate their social relevance, and then they will be relevant to philanthropists old and new.
I just want to mention the last question that all of us can think about. We don't have time to answer it, but this is from a colleague in Saudi Arabia. How can we align the digital transformation and the fourth industrial revolution with the future mission of museums? That's your homework, András. Please come back to us with that answer sometime. I think that's your next book.
Okay.
as we said, there's a generational shift that's very much at work, along with all the other shifts that you so brilliantly and eloquently articulated for us today. It's wonderful to have you in this forum. I hope to get you to Abu Dhabi in person soon. And we're all beginning to feel like the world's lights are going back on. So we look forward to our continuing conversation. And thank you all for tuning in today. And hope that you'll enjoy the next 2 days of the Culture Summit Abu Dhabi.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, everyone.